This is Dr. Pankaj Kumar, your mentor, and in this session we will be talking about reproduction in organism, right? So first of all, let's talk about what exactly is reproduction. You know, it's an important biological phenomena, right? And here what happens that any organism is going to produce an organism similar to its own type. Okay, so basically it is a continuity of the life, right? So broadly, we divide reproduction in two parts or two types, what we can say, that is asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction, right? One by one, we will discuss about all these reproductions. So in this series, let's first of all begin with the asexual reproductions. So first of all, let's learn about the features of the asexual reproductions. You see, in case of asexual reproductions, what happens that offsprings are produced from a single parent, right? And they are going to divide by mitosis, or we can say meiosis is not there, okay? And since meiosis is not there, so there is no chance of any variations, right? And we can say it is one of the rapid way of reproductions, okay? And perhaps this is the best way of reproduction during the favorable conditions, okay? But the most important thing is that whatever the offsprings that are produced, they are identical and the variations are not produced. So it has its own advantage and disadvantages. We will talk when we will finish up with the different types of asexual reproductions, right? So let's learn few of the types of asexual reproduction, okay? So in that series, first of all, let's talk about the binary fission. That is the simplest of the reproductions, and binary fission is going to occur in case of bacteria or prokaryote and in protozoans, okay? Mind it, the moment we talk about the bacteria, in case of bacteria, the cell division is amitosis, but in case of protozoans, the cell division is mitosis, okay? So in case of binary fission, what happens that first of all the genetic material get duplicated, right? And after the duplications, these two genetic material migrate towards the two poles, okay? In case of bacteria, it is with the help of plasma membrane. In case of protozoa, it is the spindle fiber, because we know very well when the mitosis is there, then division is going to occur through the spindle fiber only, right? And finally, what will happen that furrow will appear, and it will eventually divide the entire thing into two types, okay? Let's see the steps. So in the very first step, what happens? Cell will elongate, right? As you can see over here. So here what happens, cell is actually elongating. Then the bacterial genome will replicate and it will remain attached to the plasma membrane, though it is not visible in the diagram, but actually it is attached to the plasma membrane or mesosome, what we can say, because that is the things which helps in the distribution, okay? Now what happens, the duplicated DNA separate and migrate to the elongated part, as you can see over there, okay? And this is followed by the appearance of the furrow, you can see over there, right? Cleavage furrow formed, and once the cleavage furrow formed, then there is a formation of a cell wall over there. So that is actually your cell wall, okay? And finally, these two cells are actually formed. This is how the binary fissions happen, right? As I told you, it is the simplest, and most of the time it occurs during the favorable conditions, okay? Right. Let's talk about the budding. Now it is frequently observed in case of yeast, right? What happens here that there is a unequal division and the small birds are produced, as you can see there. So this is the small birds are produced, and then there is a series of birds are produced over there like this. So these are the birds are produced, right? Later what happens, it actually gets separated, and after separation each single one is capable of forming the new plant. So this is how the budding happens, okay? Now let's talk about the sporulation, mostly observed in bacteria, or we can say in amoeba or protozoa. So what happens during unfavorable condition, amoeba withdraws its pseudopodia and secrete a 3-layered covering or cyst, okay? You can see there that this is a cystation that is going to form, right? So this entire phenomena is actually called as a incystation, right? And during favorable condition, what happens, the incystis amoeba divide by multiple fission, as you can see over in the diagram, okay? And as a result, there is a minute amoeba or pseudopodiospores is actually formed, right? And eventually what happens, that cyst is going to burst, and as a result, what will happen? That large number of spores are going to be released. Okay, and this entire phenomena is actually called as a sporulation. So that is also one of the asexual process through which the reproduction happens. Okay, right. Let's talk about some of the asexual spores in case of algae. The first, what we call juice spores. You see, it is a motile spores, right? So in Chlamydomonas and Eulothrix, in Cladophora, what happens? That these spores are produced, right? And these spores helps in the formation of a new plant. Okay. Similarly, there is a planospores. These are non-motile. Okay. These are non-motile thin-walled spores, right? And that found in case of Chlorella. Now, echinete. Now, what happens? This is a resting spore, and here what happens? That protoplast is actually rounds off and lose water, and cell is filled with starch. Okay. So such single fragment is called as a echinete. You can see in the diagram, mostly that is formed in filamentous form. Okay, and when the favorable condition return, then each one is capable of forming a new plant, right? Similarly, there is a hypnospore, that is a thick-walled spore. Okay, thick-walled non-motile spore, that is primarily found in Vaucheria and Chlamydomonas. So that is also one of the method of the reproduction. Okay. Now let's talk about asexual spores in case of fungi. In that things, the most important is sporangia. Now what happens? The sporangia is produced within the sporangium. So this particular structure is actually called as a sporangium, right? Here spores formation are indigenous because it is enclosed by a membrane. So when membrane burst, then what happens? All the spores are released, and these spores are capable of forming a new plant by germination. When they germinate, they form a germ tube, and by the germ tube, again a new fungi is formed. Okay, mostly this is found in the oomycetes. So oomycetes are basically characterized by the reproduction of sporangia. Okay, also found in case of zygomycetes, for instance in case of Mucor, Rhizopus. So the asexual mode of reproduction is the sporangia only. Okay, so in the same series there is one more, what we call conidia. Okay, now have a look at conidia. You see, there are few structure in conidia that we have to keep in mind. First of all, the base structure. This is what we call conidiophore, right? Within the conidiophore, there is another structure what we call metule. Now mind it, conidiophore and metule both can be branched, but within the metule, you see a bottle-shaped structure. This is what we call sterigmata. Okay, and within the sterigmata, this conidia are present in basipetal succession. What is the meaning of basipetal succession? That the older one is the top, the newer one is actually the bottom. So it is released from the older one. So that's why we call it the basipetal. And since it is not enclosed by any membrane, we call them exogenous in origin, right? So this is exogenous formation. Okay, that is found in penicillium, that is ascomycetes, that frequently reproduces by the conidia, right? Now let's talk about the vegetative propagation in plants. You know, vegetative propagation in plants can be natural as well as it can be artificial. Okay, so the natural means includes runners, bulbs, tubers, corms, suckers and plantlets. Okay, what we see that the underground modification of stems like rhizome, tuber, bulb and corms, so actually these are the organs for perennation as well as the vegetative propagation. At the same time, there are some subaerial modification as we find in case of Pistia and in Cynoria. They also use for the propagating plants. Okay, and there are few cases in which leafy roots are found. For instance, take an example of Bryophyllum. So the Bryophyllum propagate through the leaf cuttings. So they are also capable of growing into a new plant with the help of the leaf cuttings. Okay. As far as the artificial means are concerned, it includes cutting, grafting, layering and tissue culture, right? So through that also we can resort to the vegetative propagation in case of plants. So all these are actually taught separately in class 12 when we talk about separately the different techniques of the tissue culture. Okay. Another important thing is that you see propagation observed only among the dicot plants. It is not observed in monocot plants. Why? Because in case of monocots, what happens that they lack vascular cambium, since they do not have a cambium. So that's why it is difficult for them to go for frequent propagations. Okay, so that's why whatever the propagating methods or propagating organs we see, basically that is observed in case of dicot, right? Now let's talk about the advantages. One of the advantages of asexual reproduction is that we are going to get genetically identical plants. Okay. Moreover, it is less expensive, and that is a rapid method of multiplications. And the quality of the fruits and flowers can be prepared by grafting. Okay. And through it, the common infection can be easily taken care of. Right. So these are the advantages. But of course, there are some disadvantages as well. So of course, the genetic variations are not produced, right? So they do not contribute significantly in the organic evolution. So vegetative organ useful for propagation cannot be preserved for a long. That is another disadvantage. Or vegetative multiplication causes overcrowding. Okay, and this causes severe competition for space and nutrients, right? So these are some of the disadvantages of the asexual reproductions. Okay, so we are done with the asexual. In the next, we will be talking about the sexual reproduction. Okay, now first of all, learn what are the character of sexual reproductions. Now you see, in case of sexual reproduction, the production of gametes is there, and the gametes are going to fuse. So when the two gametes fuse, we call them syngamy, right? How the gametes are produced? Gametes are produced by the meiosis. So one of the most important, or I can say the two most important character for any of the sexual reproduction is, one is the meiosis, right? And second is the syngamy. So these two characters is present in any of the sexual reproduction across all living beings, right? So what happens during meiosis? There is a random segregation, okay? And this also ensures the production of the genetic variation. So it is also going to produce the genetic variation. So that is one of the important attributes of the sexual reproductions, right? So the moment we talk about any sexual life for any of the living organism, it begins with a juvenile or vegetative, juvenile in case of animals and vegetative in case of plants, right? Then it goes for the very reproductive phase. And after reproduction, then it goes for the maturation phase. So all the living beings are actually passing through this particular phase. Okay. So some of the few important traits of this entire sexual reproduction we will discuss in the next sections, right? So let's talk about that. What are the important phases for the sexual reproduction? The first and foremost is the pre-fertilization phases. So what happens that the pre-fertilization phases include all the events of sexual reproduction prior to the fusion of the gametes. So naturally it involves two main pre-fertilization events, and these are gametogenesis and gamete transfer, right? Similarly, if you talk about the fertilization, it is nothing but the fusion of the male and the female gamete, which is known as syngamy, and eventually it produces zygote. So there are few cases in which what happens that the female gamete undergoes development to form new organism without fertilization, right? And this phenomena is actually called as a parthenogenesis. Okay. And if you talk about the post-fertilization, that primarily refers to the formation of embryo followed by the organogenesis. So one by one, we will talk about all three of them, right? First, let's talk about the pre-fertilization, that is gametogenesis. So as you know very well, gametogenesis refers to the process of formation of two types of gametes, what we call male and female, right? Gametes are haploid, but mind it, they are produced by both haploid and diploid organism. Okay, haploid in which case when the plant is going to be having a haplontic life cycle. So what happens that organism belongs to Monera, fungi, algae and bryophytes have a haploid plant body, right? So they produce gamete by the mitotic division. Okay. Now the gametes when produced by both sex are identical, Okay, so this is actually observed in case of isogamous reproduction, and they are primarily observed in the lower plants. Now, on contrary, what we see that higher organisms are diploid, and in them the gametes are always produced by the meiosis. So in diploid organisms, what we see, there is a specialized cells called meiocytes or gamete mother cells. They undergo meiosis and they form the gametes, right? So at the end of meiosis, what we see, there is only one set of chromosome, and that gets incorporated into gamete, right? And the two gametes, when comes together, they restores the original chromosome number. So that is the pre-fertilization gametogenesis, right? Let's talk about the gamete transfer, how the gamete is going to be transferred. Okay, so what happens in case of primitive species, let it be say fungi, algae, bryophytes, pteridophytes, what happens that the gametes are transmitted with the help of water. The gametes are motile, so they need a moisture. In that moisture, the gamete swims and they reach to the female reproductive organ, right? But in case of seeded plants, for instance, take an example of gymnosperm and angiosperm, transfer of male gamete is effected through the pollination. Okay, and if you talk about the animals, in case of animals, there are different types of copulatory organs which vary from species to species, right? And they eventually effect the very process of the transfer of male gamete to the female gamete. Okay, now let's talk about the fertilization. Now in case of fertilization, what we see that male and female gamete fuses to form zygote, right? And this event what we call syngamy. What happens in aquatic animals, the fertilization is external because both gametes are released in a water, and in the water they fuses. After fusion, they form a zygote. Okay, but in those cases, what happens? There are a large number of gametes are released. Why? To ensure the very success of the fertilization, and at the same time, large number of species are also produced. Okay, but these offsprings are extremely vulnerable to the predators, and eventually very small number of survive and they reach the adulthood. So that is the things that happens in case of aquatic animals where the fertilization is internal. If we talk about fertilization in higher organism, fertilization is internal. Okay, that is going to occur inside the body. Here what happens that these organism, egg is formed inside the female body where they fuse with the male gamete. Okay, and in these what happens that the male gamete is motile and has to reach the egg in order to fuse with it. And here also the large number of sperms are produced. Okay, and there is a significant reduction in the number of eggs, right? If you talk about in seed plants, what happens? The gametes are non-motile, okay, and they are carried to the female gamete by the pollen tubes, and the event what we call it is a syphnogamy. Okay, this is about the fertilization. Now let's talk about the post-fertilization events. You know very well that all sexually reproducing organisms produce diploid zygote. So zygote is a common one. Okay, so every development is going to begin from the zygote only. So organism where the fertilization is going to be external, what happens? Zygote is formed, and that zygote develop a thick wall around themselves, and usually they undergo for the period of the rest. And after the period of the rest, they germinate and eventually they form the new plant after going through the reductional division as well. Okay, so this is the things that is going to happen in case of all those species in which the fertilization is external, right? Now, if you talk about the higher animals, what happens? That the zygote undergoes for the development of the embryo, okay, and in the process zygote undergoes cell division as well as the cell differentiation. Now you see, based on the development of the zygote, animals are categorized into two categories, what we call oviparous and viviparous. So in case of oviparous animals like reptiles and birds, what happens? That the fertilized eggs are covered by the hard calcareous cells, and they are laid in safe place in the environment, and after the period of incubation, what happens? That the young ones hatch out. But in case of viviparous animals, what happens? The zygote develops into a young one inside the body of the female organism. And after the gestation period, they come out, right? So they are delivered out of the body of the female organism. So this is how we can differentiate between the oviparous and the viviparous animals. In case of viviparous animals, what happens? Because of the proper embryonic care and protections, the chances of survival of young one is quite high in case of the viviparous organism. Okay, so this is the main thing about the post-fertilization things. So right now we have discussed about the generalized character or generalized features in case of the sexual reproduction in terms of the pre-fertilization, fertilization and post-fertilization stages, right? Finally, let's talk about the post-fertilization events in case of plants. In flowering plant, what happens? Zygote is formed. Again, here also zygote is going to form. So within the ovule, what happens? Zygote develop into embryo, and eventually ovule after fertilization will develop into seed, and the entire ovary will develop into a fruit. Okay. So if you talk about the fruit, so what happens? Fruit develops a protective thick wall called pericarp. Okay, that is protective in function. Okay, so in this diagram you can see that this is a pericarp and this is the seed, right? So after dispersal, what happens? Seed germinate under favorable condition to produce a new plant, right? So this is the entire thing as far as the reproduction in organism is concerned. I don't have to discuss anything more. So let's conclude the entire things by simply just keeping in our mind that these are the two categories, that is the asexual and the sexual reproductions, and through which the life ensures their own continuity, right? That's all. Thank you.